Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Welcome to the last video update on the situation on the front lines for the year of 2022. And what a year it was, indeed. You probably didn't know, I kind of never thought about this, but this year started for me with the death of my father. And let's just say, going further into February, March, and so on, the situation didn't improve much. But I'm going to talk about what the year was and what was happening during the year in the second part of the video. Right now, let us jump into the map situation and I'll give you a quick update on what's happening so far. Spoiler alert, not a lot on the strategic sense as I make it. Now, I told you already a couple of videos and so on ago that Russians have reinforced this area, and now and more kind of analysts are starting to catch up on it, and they're now reporting that yes, there is indeed increased activity, increased fighting in the area, and well, that was as expected, but no advancements so far on either side. There is reported advancements of the Ukrainians. It has been reported, though, as with everything right now in this area, when the things are reported captured, it doesn't mean that they will be held for the if the counterattack comes. So I'm going to report to you what has been reported as captured, and this is this small village and this settlement over here. So essentially, Ukraine was able to advance, and this is probably the shortest they have to Svatovo. It's about 10 kilometers. So Ukraine is about 10 kilometers from Svatovo, so even the smaller artillery are now being engaged in Ukraine. And we see that despite the things are being super slow, Ukraine is continuing their advance towards Svatovo. And obviously, when I say that there has been advancements, there has also been fighting in the area north of it. But we'll see if the Russians will counterattack, and then we'll go forward. Reports are, I already told you that the Russians have reinforced the area. So the fighting is happening. It's still undecided. The hot zones are still Chironopopivka, Pishane, Zhitlivka, Dibrova. Again, as far as I understood, Ukraine controls majority of the settlements or something like this, and they are pretty much fighting on the outskirts of Dnipro. But the Russians are defending, and they have fortified positions in the area, and now they've been also reinforced. So, but we definitely know that Ukraine is at worst couple of kilometers from Kreminna, but actually I know that already some fighting is happening indeed within the city line. But the point is, it's just going to be taking time for Ukraine to finally advance and get to the position. This whole thing is slowed down, and pretty much that's the name of the game. Russians are continually trying to advance from Yakovlivka, but they're unable to. They're being stopped. So again, fighting around Yakovlivka. Around Bakhmut, the same thing. There is now Opitne is 50% split pretty much. The Russians are trying to advance south. It doesn't really matter, and they don't really have the big success. So, but the point is that all of the analysts are now certain that nothing threatens Bakhmut, like nothing threatens the encirclement of Bakhmut. What is said that Russians are having, how do we say, like periodic success some places, but that periodic success comes with A, great cost, B, oftentimes, like when Ukrainians send reinforcements, it will be a pushback, and then they will need to do the same thing again. But the idea is that the fighting has been happening in the same positions for a long time now, and despite Russians advancing someplace, this is not really improving their position significantly. I'm not going to be talking about what's coming in the next year. That's going to be the whole point of my next video. I'm going to be talking about 2023. But so far, things are looking quite okay for Bakhmut. Avdiivka, again, more reports are that the Russians are trying to storm Avdiivka, trying to storm Vodyane, trying to storm Kamenka here from the north, Vesele. So the same kind of situation that is happening so far. On the south side, I usually don't report on the, well, except for the standoff that I was always telling you about. I usually don't report on Ukrainian strikes or Russian strikes just because both sides are striking each other's targets quite often. But I think it's about time that I at least make an acknowledgement of this, that Ukrainians have been systematically targeting logistical supplies, logistical chains around Tokmak, Melitopol, Berdyansk, and so on and so on. So Ukrainians are really putting a pressure on the south, and they're really trying to disrupt logistics. And many analysts are agreeing that this is the preparation for the attack. The unfortunate part is that this is going to be extremely mild winter. And while it is good because that means that Russia cannot blackmail Europe for the warm gas, for the gas because of the warmth and because we have enough supplies, that also means that Ukrainian counterattack in the south is being postponed and postponed and postponed and postponed. I've now checked the weather forecast again in the coming week or 2 weeks. The weather is still going to be fluctuating around zero. The ground, there's still going to be some snow, some rain, so the ground is still going to be muddy. And this unfortunately buys more time for the Russians to prepare. So there are analysts that are already saying that Ukraine might have the window of a possibility closing for this counterattack. But I also hear the other voices saying, no, it's all fine because they have the options. But again, I'm going to talk about this in the next video for the 2023 and what we should expect. Just know that the counterattack of Ukrainians is not happening not because Ukraine cannot attack, but because the conditions are just not there, and Ukraine is just continuing preparation and improvement of their positions for the coming counterattack whenever it comes. With that said, I think this is going to be it for the map update. Thank you so much for watching me throughout this whole year. If this is your first video watching, like, subscribe, share. Please join us, community. I will cover this war until the end and until Ukraine actually wins. With this, let's transition into the talking and vlogging, because discussions about the year is extremely important, because we went through the whole roller coaster of us at the start of the year being completely oblivious to the fact that war can break out in Europe, period. We thought that we were living in an era where big wars, large-scale conflicts are done, at least in Europe. And we were completely living off the dividends of the Second World War. So when February came in, I think the first reaction, at least for myself, was obviously a shock, because no one was expecting a war. Like, even like now in retrospective, we're looking that yes, there was red flags and so on. We need to understand that everyone thought that Putin is just going to be politically posturing rather than invading. But I already talked about this a little bit while ago. Maybe I'll talk about this more during some of the streams. So when we were in March, I think for a lot of people, it was still the effect of shock that something like this is happening. So we didn't know how to react. We were just watching news and so on. And for a lot of analysts and so on, I think Ukraine was largely written off. Like, the West didn't want to really supply any kind of heavy weapons that would help defend Ukraine. There was no significant logistical chain supplied. And I think the only thing that was sent was mostly partisan style weapons. So like NLAWs, javelins, and so on. Ukraine was also fighting mostly with territorial defense units. And we've seen a lot of crazy videos where tanks were disabled by throwing Molotov cocktails at them. Crazy stuff. And people like going and trying to stop tanks with their bare hands, which is a little bit ridiculous. We've seen over the march, we grew into the understanding that Ukrainians have the biggest steel balls in the world to date. Because what Ukrainian nation did in in that first month is unbelievable. Instead of, despite all of the shock and awe that Russia were trying to inflict on them, it didn't work. And slowly but surely, we started following their example. We started finding the strength in ourselves to protest, to come out with posters, come out with messages supporting Ukraine, and we slowly started uh, donating any kind of humanitarian support for Ukraine that we could. And then April came in, and April was the month where the idea was, okay, Ukraine is still not going to hold it. Like, yes, Ukraine held the first part, but Russia still have these massive lines of vehicles that are heading towards Kiev. And basically, I wrote for myself that April was defined by Kiev is about to get encircled. And it was a message for about 20 days or more. That was, for example, every day there was Sky News reporter with an expert coming up and saying that Russians are about to encircle Kiev. And it was happening every single day. And then there was the big columns and whatnot and so on. But during that time, we also saw the most devastating representation of how shit the Russian army is. We saw columns getting burned, Bayraktars destroying anti-Bayraktars weapons. It was a complete nightmare for the Russians, and they got themselves in something that they were not expecting. This was also the time when Russian core and experienced elite armies and army personnel suffered the major casualties. The first Guards Tank Army suffered heavily. The VDV suffered heavily. It was a nightmare. And we've seen like columns and columns and columns of burned equipment. And at that moment, it was also very inspiring that such a small nation as Ukraine, militarily small, is fighting such a giant that was supposedly. I think this is also the time when we started thinking that maybe the Russian army is not that strong. Then we went into May. And in May, I think when Russians started retreating from Kiev, there was a very big optimism in the air that, hey, Ukraine can do this. Like, Ukraine can fight Russians. Now it was expecting that now the trees are going to be, covered in leaves. So Ukrainians will be able to do partisan activities with all these supplied javelins and NLAWs. They're just going to burn every single Russian tank, and they will just, attack Russians from all sides. So in May, there was still expectation that this is going to be a short war. This is when a lot of the narratives on the West were like, why would we supply any kind of complex weaponry if it's going to take longer for Ukrainians to be taught how to use it, and the war will be already over by that point. So we saw that, and then it didn't happen. So the Russians pulled out. Ukrainians won a couple of big battle for Kiev. They were able to push Russians back from around Kharkiv a bit. But then came June, and June was the month of blood and despair, because it was in June when Russia started like focusing and were having enough supplies and ammunition and everything to essentially burn their way forward. And the problem was that Ukraine didn't have the stock to supply them for so long. They were running out of weapons, they were running out of shells. And it was, yes, people with NLAWs and javelins, but it was people with NLAWs and javelins fighting against an army that is using the fireball tactic of burning everything before them. And NLAWs and javelins were not really that strong against it. And the West at that moment, we were still not decided on like, will we send heavy weapons and whatnot? Like, I think at that moment we already started shaming some of the countries for sending only light weapons and saying, well, where is the heavy weapons? Where is the howitzers and whatnot? But then the quantity of weapons supplied was pitiful, and it was obviously not enough. So in June, we had the biggest defeats, like pushbacks, that Russian army was able to achieve. They were able to take Kupiansk, they were able to take Izium, they were able to take Severodonetsk, Lysychansk by the end of the month. But then July came, and there's only one word that describes July: HIMARS. The arrival of high mobility long range artillery systems to Ukraine with the precision weaponry and the number of blown Russian stockpiles was skyrocketing. There was not a lot of these systems at first, so it took a little bit of a best part of July to ramp up these strikes. But over a month and so, we saw that Russia tried and failed to find an answer to HIMARS and what it did to it. Couple of machines, like couple of launch systems, were able to turn the whole world on its head. The whole Russian advantage, the whole strategy was now done, and it was being stopped. So by the August, when the August came, it was a month of the Russian end. It was the month where Russian logistics could not supply their tactics and the number of fires that they've been using. In the background, Ukraine was preparing for the counteroffensive that they've announced at the end of August in Kherson region. But September is defined not by the Kherson success, by the rapid success of Kharkiv. Because Russians overreacted to the counteroffensive of Ukrainians, they've sent all of their best troops to Kherson, which was a huge strategic mistake, and it allowed Ukraine basically to counterattack, liberate Kharkiv region, gain a lot of trophies, and completely demolish Russian positions in Donbass. This led us into November. November was the month where I think Russians thought that's like, yes, okay, like we cannot win this war easily, so it's time to go full throttle. The mobilization was announced. October. The mobilization was announced, and the Russian politicians and talking heads were still making threats that they will go and take Odessa, that they will destroy Ukraine. We didn't start anything yet. So it was the month of us cheering for Ukraine for the success and being very positive about it, and Russians saying, okay, we're going to mobilize now and we're going to roll over Ukraine. As November has shown us, it wasn't really the case. The mobilization, yes, they were able to supplement their lines and slow down Ukrainian offensive around the north Luhansk area, but it didn't save Kherson. So in November was defined by the freedom of Kherson and Ukraine essentially closing down half of the south like a bleeding wound for themselves as well as for Russians. So now Ukraine can focus on a lot shorter line and prepare for the winter offensive that they really hoped for. However, the mobilization did help the Russians. It helped close down the lines in between them. So a lot of the weaknesses that Russians were having at this moment was that they just didn't have enough manpower. And now they finally had a shitty manpower, but manpower nonetheless. Even if there's mobilized soldiers that are just firing an AK randomly or artillery shell randomly, it still needs to be dealt with. And this was the name of the game. So this slowed everything down. So when we came into December, we were really expecting that something is going to happen once the ground freezes. And Ukraine is already ready to do that because they already see the weakness that Russians are having, that they're mobilized while they can do something. If enough resources and thought is provoked, they will crumble. And Ukraine knows that. But the weather turned it all on its head, and the right were the people that said that during the winter, the fighting will slow down a little bit. Not because that Ukraine want to slow it down, not because that Russians want to slow it down, but because we just cannot have the window of opportunity to do it. So I want you all to reflect to what we went through. I want you to reflect this to position where we are. And I want to say big thanks to all of the people that supported this channel throughout the year. People that allowed me and also you essentially to support Ukrainian military, maybe indirectly. And it was great. I never was expecting that I would be able to achieve as much. I was a person working on the normal job, 9 to 5 essentially, and obviously I had some free money, but it was like, like a couple of tens of bucks, like maybe $100 that I could spend to Ukrainian military and support Ukrainian victory advancement. But I'm very thankful that this channel was able to grow, and I'm gonna continue doing this no matter what until we end up in the final day of fighting, and when we're gonna say Slava Ukraini, це перемога. It's victory. See you guys next year. I love you all.